My name is Hannah Dick, and I am a co-founder and the creative director of Bumprints. And I have the pleasure of introducing Katie Thompson, who will be giving today's presentation, who is the founder of Bumprints. And you'll be hearing more about her story and the Bumprints organization itself. And I just wanted to remind you that we do have the chat and the Q&A open, so you're welcome to drop your questions in there, and we'll have time at the end to address those. Or obviously at the end, you're welcome to come off mute and ask any questions that you might have. And Katie's going to mention a couple of our resources throughout this presentation, and I'll try and share those links in the chat when she mentions them so that you'll have access to those as well. So without further ado, Katie, go ahead.
Thank you, Hannah. Good afternoon, Minneapolis. Welcome aboard Bumprint's Flight 101 to Aviation Climate Literacy. Buckle your seatbelts, we've got a bit of a bumpy ride ahead. As a pilot, I flew enormous airliners, private jets, and even seaplanes. And when I wasn't working in the cockpit, I was that enthusiastic, clapping upon landing kind of passenger. Boarding an airplane always felt normal. It was just what I did, almost daily. As I started getting concerned about climate change, I chose not to ask difficult questions about flying. I recycled, I cleaned up beaches, and changed my eating habits, but I still had a blind spot when it came to my love of flying. Eventually, I transitioned into management as the head of flight safety for NetJets. As well as flying the aircraft, I was now in charge of assessing the risks to all our flight operations and trying to find ways to avoid them. But no one was talking about arguably the biggest risk of all, our industry's significant and growing contribution to global warming. In all this time, during all my continuous flight training and many high-level meetings, I cannot recall one meaningful conversation about the real environmental cost of what we were doing. Until one day, when the senior management team was given a presentation by an environmental consultant. We were going to plant some trees in Borneo. This was sold to us as the most exciting initiative and something that we could talk proudly about, and that was going to make our billionaires feel really great about flying. I went back to my office and started to Google, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I quickly understood that planting trees, while vitally important to heal our planet, was not going to solve aviation's dirty climate problem. So let me take you on a journey and share what I learned. As a pilot, of course, I understood that airplanes cause pollution, but the sky just seemed so vast and forgiving. I had assumed it would all just blow away and disappear into the wild blue yonder. Well, this is it, the wild blue yonder. It's actually a thin sliver of our atmosphere, only 6 to 12 kilometers high. And this is where all the emissions from every flight I've ever been on are trapped and will remain there for hundreds and probably even thousands of years. So long after the memories of all our vacations have faded, these gases will remain, heating up our atmosphere for generations to come. I was also shocked to learn that there was something called climate lag. So what we're experiencing now is based on our emissions from about 10 years ago. Anyway, let's dig into how flying is affecting the climate, and then look at what the airlines think the answers are, and then we'll finish up with some immediate actions that you can take today as concerned citizens. So the first big problem, as I already mentioned, are the carbon dioxide emissions. I'll show you a few graphs and charts, but I'll try and make them as simple as possible, so bear with me. What we're really interested in is, are the lines still going up or are they starting to come down? So what we're looking at here is carbon emissions over time from international aviation. The black line is historical, and the blue one, the projection based on current policies and action. And the dip you see is from the pandemic. So what this graph is showing us is that emissions are not reducing. In fact, the projected blue line, which is based on current policies and action, is heading increasingly steeply in the wrong direction. And the color-coded legend on the right is warning us that we are about to overshoot even the critically insufficient grey sector. And if the industry is aligned with the Paris Agreement goal, which it says it is, of trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, then the blue line needs to reverse course and start heading sharply down towards this green section. It's also very important to understand that these emissions only account for part of the way that flying is warming our planet. So I'm sure you all know that the main problem with the carbon emissions is that they trap heat into our atmosphere. But did you know that aviation packs a double warming punch? Besides carbon, there are other things coming out of the aircraft engines that are also heating up our atmosphere, like water vapor, soot, and nitrogen oxide. We refer to these as non-CO2 effects, and they can form something called contrails. Condensation trails or contrails are those intriguing white streams that some airplanes leave behind. And contrails can actually be cooling during the day as they can reflect sunlight away from the Earth. But at night, these artificial clouds act like blankets, trapping in the heat that should be escaping during the nighttime hours. And while some contrails only last for a few minutes, others are persistent, they spread out, join up, and can last for hours. There are areas of the world where persistent contrails are more likely to form, and these unfortunately coincide with the areas where most of our flying takes place, over the USA, Europe, and the North Atlantic. So when we add together the carbon and the contrails, we start to understand that flying doesn't just have a CO2 problem, but a larger warming problem. And because understanding where contrails are going to form and how warming or cooling they may be is complex, it's easy for the industry to delay taking action, although a few companies are being proactive and doing some trials. And unsurprisingly, there's significant disagreement about how much warming we're talking about. But the debate is really about whether it just doubles or actually triples the warming from the carbon emissions alone. IATA is the biggest airline trade association, and they represent 80% of the world airlines. They're very vocal about aviation sustainability, and I will refer to them again. So what does IATA say about contrails? They say we need more science, which is a classic delaying tactic. Although the scientists believe there is already enough clear evidence to be able to take positive action today. Now, maybe you've heard people saying, but flying only accounts for less than 3% of global emissions. And this is normally followed by a statement about how we should focus our attention on other larger climate problems and leave the relatively harmless aviation industry and its frequent flyers alone. But the important word here is global, which overlooks the fact that air travel is not a global privilege. In fact, only 20% of the world has ever flown. Also notice that little yellow man, the 1%, who is responsible for 50% of the problem. Who does that 1% represent? Well, it's probably most of us. Do you take 6 or more flights a year? And by 6 flights, I mean 6 takeoff and landing. So a return flight is 2, and a connecting flight is already 4 flights. And what do you think that 80% who have never set foot on an airplane represents to the airlines? Potential, billions of dollars, a huge untapped market. So mature aviation markets like yours and like mine are still growing, but look at where the real growth is happening. Asia Pacific. So we need to talk about the emerging markets too. For example, in India, so there's a rapid growing middle class in India who understandably want to travel. Only 1% of Indians have ever traveled abroad, but the aviation market there is booming. Indian Airlines have 1,300 new commercial airliners on the order books right now. But if anyone's going to grow their markets, shouldn't it be countries like India rather than the UK and the USA, who've already caused so much of the problem and kind of grown rich in the meantime? This is a picture of all the aircraft airborne on a busy day in 2023. So at the moment, there are about 25,000 commercial airliners in our skies. But based on current orders, by 2044, that will have doubled to 50,000 airliners. And each one of these will be designed to fly on emission-producing fuels with a lifespan of about 30 years. So the more I looked at all this, the more alarmed I got. And I started looking around me to see if anyone else was alarmed. But no one seemed to be, not any of my flying colleagues, and not among my friends or family who seemed to be constantly and ever more frequently jumping on and off aircraft. Mostly, I was told that I was overreacting, that I should relax. Maybe I needed to book a vacation. After all, they reminded me, aviation is responsible for less than 3% of global emissions. Instead of going on vacation, I decided to dig a little deeper into that less than 3% number. And when I looked at flying emissions in countries that enjoy mature aviation markets, like the UK, then the numbers looked quite different. So, according to the UK government's own climate change committee, in 2025, aviation was responsible for more like 9% of the UK's total emissions. And by 2040, as other industries successfully decarbonize while aviation doesn't and keeps growing, the picture will be very different again. So by 2040, aviation will have become the highest emitting sector in the country, competing neck and neck with agriculture for that top position and responsible for a staggering 27% of total UK emissions. And everyone has to eat, whereas aviation could be considered more of a luxury good, mostly enjoyed by a very small privileged percentage of the population. So I now understood that the airline industry was facing a much bigger problem than I had ever imagined, and that problem was only getting bigger. I decided to go back to university to take a master's in sustainable aviation. Once I got this qualification, I planned to find a job in an airline sustainability team and become part of the solution, hopefully flying around the world in luxury as I did it. It was hard to find anyone offering the kind of training I was looking for, but I finally found a course, and it was in partnership with the United Nations, so that seemed promising. The first thing that we were taught was that we shouldn't worry too much about that rising emissions curve, because the aviation industry had come together and committed to fly net zero by 2050, and they had published detailed roadmaps explaining exactly how they were going to get there. Phew, I felt better already. So I started looking into these roadmaps, and they really boiled down into three main strategies. The airplanes need to burn less fuel, be flown on different kinds of fuel, basically not fossil fuels, and then any carbon emissions that were still being added to the atmosphere needed to be removed again. Let's have a look into some of these strategies. Fuel is expensive, right? So there's always been a focus on trying to design aircraft that burn less fuel, pretty much since the Wright brothers first took to the air in 1903. The promising blue line on this graph shows that each new generation of aircraft is more fuel efficient than the last. But the blue line is starting to flatten out because, after all, there are only so many ways to reduce how much fuel an aircraft engine burns. And the yellow line represents the growth in passenger kilometers over the same time period. Notice that it is not flattening out, but rather steepening. So in the last 30 years, as aircraft have become twice as efficient, demand has quadrupled. So as a result, total emissions have doubled. Because if aircraft burn less fuel, the airline costs go down, and so they can make tickets cheaper. So these savings have been passed on to the passengers, and flying has become more and more affordable to more and more people. Ticket prices are also kept artificially low because aviation has always enjoyed significant tax exemptions and breaks. Did you know, for example, that international jet fuel is completely tax-free? These tax breaks give air travel a competitive edge over other methods of less polluting public transport. This is a page from an airline sustainability report, which reassures us that their newer aircraft burn 20 to 35% less fuel than the ones they replace. But can you see the problem here? Right? So they retired 3 aircraft in 2024, but added 13 new ones. And we also need to consider what's happening to those retired aircraft, the gas guzzlers. Are they being responsibly disposed of, or are they being sold on to poorer countries where they continue to add to total global emissions? On the next page, they show us this reassuring graph of their annual carbon emissions decreasing year on year. This metric, decreasing carbon emissions per passenger, is the one that airlines just love to talk about. But we know by now that emissions per passenger is only half of the story. This is the graph you want to look at, and it's not such a reassuring picture. This is the total emissions from their flights, and they don't like talking about this metric quite as much. So the more I thought about it, the more obvious it got. No one wants us to lose the freedom to fly when we really need to travel. We experienced that during COVID, and it was terrible. So then we need to fly smarter, and that means using the most modern aircraft and putting as many passengers on as possible on each aircraft, and then operating them as efficiently as possible. And it obviously takes an enormous amount of fuel to get a large aircraft off the ground and to climb all the way up to cruising altitude. And the bigger and heavier the aircraft is, the more fuel it burns. Every additional kilo of weight on board the aircraft increases the fuel burn. So apart from buying the newest aircraft, what else are airlines doing in order to burn less fuel? Well, there are lots of things, and one of the most important is to remove all the excess non-essential weight from the aircraft. So how are they doing that? Well, here are just a few examples. So they keep reducing the free carry-on baggage allowance. They're installing thinner and lighter seats, and they're shrinking the size of the toilets. And these are all great and effective initiatives. But hang on a second. What about if you turn left when you board the aircraft? It's very easy in the front of the aircraft to find examples where airlines are not at all focused on fuel savings. This is where you find the lie flat beds in private suites and spa showers. My ex-husband flies for Emirates. This is a picture of an Emirates onboard lounge. So my teenage son gets free first-class tickets when he goes to visit his dad in Dubai. Nothing to do with me. And my son recently came home with tales of how he'd been given a private first-class suite in the middle of the aircraft, and they had actually built LED fake windows in the walls of his suite on which they had live streamed the outside view for him. So yeah, we thought that was a bit excessive. And expanding these luxury offerings are what most large airlines are focusing on at the moment. This graph is showing how the big 3 American airlines are all very busy rapidly expanding the size of their premium seats. And I believe Minneapolis is a Delta hub, and they've actually got the most premium seats of all 3 at the moment. But let's talk about my current favorite, which is Swiss Airlines. So their economy seats have gotten lighter and lighter, which is great. But Swiss has installed such heavy new first class seats that they've actually caused balancing problems in their Airbus A330 aircraft. The center of gravity, which needs to be kept within a certain range for safety, has shifted too far forward. And the airline's response was not to lighten the first class offerings or to add some improvements to the economy section to balance it out. But instead, they decided to counterbalance the first class section by installing 1.5 tons of permanent lead plates in the tail of the aircraft. And we mustn't forget private jets, another booming market. These aircraft are definitely not designed primarily for fuel efficiency. The focus is more on speed and comfort. And 40% of the flights have flown completely empty, what we call positioning flights, in order to pick up passengers. So while burn less fuel seems like a great strategy, what I learned, in fact, was that jet fuel consumption is increasing every year. But maybe that's okay, I thought, because what about these green fuels I keep hearing people talking about? Now, I don't know about you, but my brain turns off when people start talking about things like hydrocarbons. I find it easier to compare fuels to foods. After all, they are both energy sources. So planes need fuel, like humans need food, and different kinds of food depending on what we're hoping to achieve. Traditional jet fuel made from fossil fuels could be compared to a steak. Both are very efficient sources of energy, but both also have serious environmental consequences. So, like humans, airplanes also need to change their diet. So-called sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, could be considered the fuel equivalent of a veggie burger, a simple meat substitute that provides similar amounts of energy and is often a better environmental choice. SAF can be made from many different ingredients, but the most common type of SAF used today is made from used cooking oil and the discarded animal fat from slaughterhouses. And using SAF is simple. It's just mixed in with traditional jet fuel and is already being flown on today. So what are the positives about using SAF? Well, of course, it is definitely a better solution than continuing to extract and burn more fossil fuels. And initial studies have shown that SAF produces less soot, and this may reduce contrail formation. And like solar energy, SAF could provide smaller countries with energy independence because SAF can also be made from agricultural and forestry waste, seaweed, maybe even sewage. So each country should have the ability to start tankers having to move the fuel around. Did you know that nearly 40% of global shipping is dedicated just to moving fossil fuels around? So if we can start making them locally, of course, that's much better. So as I mentioned, the most common type of SAF, at least the one that's used today, is made from used cooking oil and discarded animal fat. But there's only so much used, 8 million barrels a day of it. And used cooking oil is becoming such a valuable commodity that we are now hearing worrying stories about new palm oil being mislabeled and sold as used cooking oil. And I don't quite understand how animal fat can be considered sustainable when we know animal agriculture is such an environmental problem. And this sort of SAF also raises some other difficult questions. For example, if you don't eat pork and beef for ethical or religious reasons, how do you feel about flying on it? Most of the other ingredients that can also be used are also in limited supply and can cause deforestation or compete with food production. And also making the fuel requires a significant amount of renewable energy, which is also a limited resource. And aviation's net zero plan does not seem to have considered the other industries who also need access to all these raw materials and the renewable energy. And there are several studies showing that all these resources would be more effective if used elsewhere to decarbonize other industries. It's also important to understand that the amount of CO2 emissions coming out of the back of the engine are exactly the same with SAF as with jet fuel. All the savings come in the production process. Nonetheless, 65% of the net zero strategy is based on flying on 100% SAF by 2050. So I decided to dig into how quickly the production of SAF was scaling up. And while doing that, I stumbled across a slightly worrying report called Missed Targets, which explained how the aviation industry has never met any of its environmental goals, which did make me wonder if net zero by 2050 could be just one more missed target. Let's look specifically at some of the historical SAF targets. So in 2007, IATA set a goal that 10% of global aviation fuel supply would come from SAF by 2017. However, this target and several further targets were never met and were quietly abandoned. And by 2024, still only 0.3% of the aircraft fuel supply was SAF. And the official number isn't out yet for 2025, but it certainly wasn't the 2% that they were aiming for. I think the final figure is maybe 0.6% by 2025. And so 0.3% by 2024, but the total amount of jet fuel in 2024 increased by 2%. So SAF production is not even keeping up with industry growth. We need to electrify everything, right? So what about aircraft? Well, if jet fuel is the equivalent of steak, then electric aircraft are flying on watermelons. Because just like watermelons, batteries take up a lot of space and they're heavy to carry around with you. There are some places where electric aircraft will be very useful. They're already being used by a few flight schools, and these training aircraft can take 2 passengers up for a 30-minute flying lesson. And larger models will shortly be available for some commercial flights. And there'll be a really good solution for very short regional flights, for example, connecting islands to the mainland. The electric aircraft in this picture could be flying by 2029 with an all-electric range of 200 kilometers while carrying 30 passengers. So electric commercial flight will soon become a reality, but only for very short flights. Hydrogen is the last new energy source we're going to look at, and we can compare popcorn to hydrogen. Because to get the same calories from popcorn as you get from steak, you need to eat a much bigger portion of it. The same is true for hydrogen. For the same energy content, a much bigger volume is needed. So as a result, airframes and engines will need to be completely redesigned in order to fly on hydrogen. Airbus has been working on a hydrogen aircraft and was aiming to bring it to market by 2035, but they have already delayed this plan by 5 to 10 years. This is unsurprising as hydrogen poses some really complicated logistical challenges. To be used as a fuel, hydrogen needs to be liquefied, and to do this, it needs to be cryogenically stored at minus 253 degrees Celsius during distribution on the airport and even in the aircraft. And the distribution network is also a huge challenge because unlike jet fuel, which is piped into the big airports, hydrogen would at least initially need to be trucked in. At Heathrow, it has been estimated that that could mean a hydrogen tanker driving through the gates every 40 seconds. So overall, flying on hydrogen is a very big and complex undertaking, and there are some skeptics who question if it's ever going to happen. So in summary, so far we have not been very successful in changing the fuel we're flying on. SAF is proving hard to scale, and its sustainability credentials are a little bit flimsy. For now, electric aircraft are only going to be able to substitute very short flights, although let's hope for some more technological breakthroughs. And hydrogen is still only a possibility and quite a distant one at that. So the third and final pillar of the net zero by 2050 plan is carbon removal, which can be broken down into two areas. Carbon offsets, which are financial investments in schemes that aim to remove carbon elsewhere. Planting trees is the most common, although there are lots of interesting schemes available. And while planting trees and restoring nature is so important, and what we should all be doing, should this be used to justify ever more flying? And carbon capture, which is a technological solution using procedures designed to capture CO2 directly from the air, well, I would love to be optimistic about it, but so far the results are not great. And although it's an important part of their net zero strategy, even IATA, the trade association, has admitted that carbon capture is still a distant and unproven option. So at the end of the day, it's vastly more efficient and cost effective for all of us to focus on avoiding adding more carbon emissions to the atmosphere rather than trying to capture them after the fact. When it came time to write my thesis, I had lost faith that any of these fancy roadmaps were going to actually get the emission curves heading in the right direction. But I also realized that none of these roadmaps talked about the passenger. And I wondered what might happen if we gave passengers the information and the tools they needed to help. And just maybe I thought that shifting passenger behavior could send a demand signal to the airlines that might focus their attention on the solutions available today rather than relying on unproven future technologies to emerge and to save them. So I went through the roadmaps again, this time looking for any passenger action that could make a positive impact. And at the end, I created a pilot-style checklist of all these action items. Because as a passenger, there are ways you can reduce the emissions of every trip. And the more I researched, I started to realize that better passenger choices could reduce the emissions of a trip by as much as 50%. No new technology, no big breakthroughs, just educated consumers making better choices. And lo and behold, I was right, because a big study just came out this month, and the numbers are even bigger than I had initially thought. So I won't have time today to run through all the actions available, but Hannah will be sharing links to our website and social media accounts where you can find all our free tools and resources, as well as a downloadable checklist. And we also have an Ask Us Anything form, which you will put in the chat for any questions we don't get to or anything that comes up for you later. But let's have a look at the checklist. So the first section of the checklist covers things we all need to consider whenever a travel opportunity arises. So, is your journey necessary? Opportunities to travel bombard us constantly, from pop-ups on our phones enticing us to visit Paris, to the posters of sunlit beaches brightening up our commute. And then there are the Taylor Swift concerts and the high school reunions and the destination weddings and the work conferences. For many of us, air travel has never been cheaper or easier. And as lockdown so recently demonstrated, having the freedom to travel by air is hugely important. But it also showed us that not every individual trip is. Most of us flew significantly less when we understood that our most vulnerable family members and our immediate communities were at risk. Now the climate crisis is accelerating. Again, it is the oldest, the youngest, the sickest, and the poorest who are being the most affected. And the climate crisis requires a similar slowdown in air travel. So we need to sort our flights into those we really need to take and those that we kind of don't need to, because we all need to fly less. And I know public transport in America is not great, but before you fly, always research if there are other ways, non-flying options to get to your destination. And combining reasons to travel is also a way to fly less. If you just have to go to that Taylor Swift concert, can you combine it with your annual vacation rather than go on two separate trips? And then when it comes to choosing a destination, remember that every kilometer not flown matters. So think about what it is that you want or need to achieve, and then consider the closest destination where this could be accomplished. So if you're in London and want to take your kids to Disneyland, why not choose Paris instead of Orlando? If you're in America and just need a foreign beach vacation, consider the Bahamas instead of Bali. You get the picture. Because it's those long haul flights, especially those over 4,000 kilometers, that do the most damage. This is because of the huge distances they travel. They only make up 6% of all flights, but cause over 50% of the carbon emissions. So when thinking about where to travel, the shorter the distance you can fly, the better. Think about whether you're a flight pusher. This could be in your work life or your home life. Do you influence, approve, or encourage the flying behavior of other people? Do more people fly because of you, or fly more often or further? When you first start looking for flight pushers, you see them everywhere. They organize tempting yoga retreats in Bali. They're the friends and family members who suggest far-flung group vacations and family reunions without considering the accompanying flight emissions. They're well-meaning school teachers who offer to take our school children on yet another school trip that involves air travel. The great thing about realizing you're a flight pusher means that you can actually have a much bigger positive impact. And while we're talking about flight pushers, let's talk about my favorite one, which is Taylor. So Taylor Swift has received significant negative press over her excessive use of private jets. Her two private jets flew the equivalent of 7 times around the Earth in 2023. But that's not the worst of it. Many American super fans flew to Europe to see Taylor Swift perform in 2024. European concert tickets were just so much cheaper and easier to get hold of. So much so that United Airlines reported that demand for flights from New York to Lisbon increased by 25% when Taylor Swift was performing in Portugal. But that's not even why she's my favorite flight pusher. What cemented Taylor Swift as flight pusher extraordinaire was when she signed an exclusive deal with Singapore during her world tour. She agreed to play 6 concerts in Singapore and none in any of the neighboring countries. So this decision alone meant that 300,000 Swifties from all over Southeast Asia flew into the island of Singapore to watch her play. So before you decide to book a flight, make sure that you've really thought about it first. You can see that even taking one flight less has a much bigger impact than many of the other climate actions available to us, like recycling or going plant-based. Even installing solar panels or driving an electric vehicle has less impact than avoiding just one long-haul trip. Okay, this is where the real savings start. So you've decided your trip is important or necessary. You've chosen the closest destination. You've explored whether you combine work and leisure trips. You've checked there's not a non-flying travel option. So this next section of the checklist helps you to identify the least harmful flight for your upcoming journey. The concept is simple. We're looking for the airline that flies the lightest, most fuel efficient, and with the most passengers on board. And the good news is that it's easy to find this information. Google Flights is one good option. They provide carbon emissions in all their flight searches as a public good, they say, using a trusted carbon calculator. So we'll use Google Flights for the examples in this presentation. So here I searched for a one-way economy non-stop flight from London to New York. And the first results we see are the top flights. These are chosen by Google based on price and convenience. And if we look down at the CO2 emissions, we can already see a significant difference. The first recommended flight will produce 395 kilos of carbon, and the second one, 587 kilograms of carbon. So that's an easy decision, right? But we can also see that both these flights produce above average emissions. In fact, Google is recommending a flight here that creates 83% more emissions than the average flight on this route. So I'm sorry, Google, but I'm not sure if that's really in the public good. But wait, let's change the filter to sorted by emissions. By doing that, we find a much better option. 240 kilos of carbon and a flight which is 25% less emissions than the average for this route. How can there be so much difference between such similar flights? Well, the answer here is the aircraft type. The Boeing 787 is one of the most modern and fuel-efficient aircraft. And here is something new. Some search engines are starting to give you an idea of the contrail warming potential of your flight as well. So if you can combine low emissions with low warming, then you're really onto a winner. Do you book your own flights? Because if not, and your flights are booked for you through a travel agent or your company's travel department or a member of your family, ask the person booking the flights to consider the emissions information when searching for your flights. And if this is not information they're already considering, ask them why not. They may not even know what you're talking about. So remember that climate change is a subject we all need to be talking about, and every conversation is an opportunity to raise awareness. This is a great graphic showing an example of the space taken up by and the carbon emissions produced by the different seat classes. And it's not just the space taken up by these luxury seats. which can vary from larger reclinable seats to spacious closed suites. These seats also offer extra amenities ranging from gourmet meals to onboard bars and lounges, prayer rooms, walk-in spa showers, and usually lots of freebies like designer pajamas and toiletry bags. And alongside all these onboard products and services come an increased flight attendant to passenger ratio, a more generous baggage allowance, wider aisles, and larger exclusive use toilets. And remember that new study I mentioned that just came out? The one that said we could cut global emissions by 50 to 75% without any new technology? Well, these luxury flyers were not very impressed with some of its findings. We've talked about choosing the closest suitable destination. However, that also needs to be combined with the most direct route of flight to make that meaningful. Have you ever found yourself flying in the wrong direction before catching a connecting flight? Direct flights provide the shortest route between two destinations and are normally more fuel efficient than taking connecting flights. As I already mentioned, the takeoff and climb phases of a flight are the most fuel intensive, followed by the landing phase, so it makes sense to try and minimize these. So here are two options if you're flying from Minneapolis to Los Angeles. I wonder what would make someone choose the option to fly via Houston. Frequent flyer programs are designed to encourage customers to fly more often and to upgrade to luxury seats. The more you pollute, the more you are rewarded. They also create strong customer loyalty, with members tending to fly exclusively on their preferred airline in order to obtain air miles or points. Perhaps that's one reason why a passenger would choose that United flight, the one connecting through Houston. These programs also encourage extra unnecessary flying. Have you ever heard of mileage runs? These are flights taken solely to achieve or maintain their elite status. They tend to be very long indirect routes designed to gain maximum points, and people taking these trips sometimes never even leave the airport. One frequent flyer on Reddit described flying to Hawaii for just 90 minutes in order to accrue points, adding that, quote, 7 of the other people in the front cabin were all doing the same thing as me, flying just to get their status, unquote. Okay, you've booked the best flight you can find and you're on your way. Let's look at what else you can do. Pack lightly. The lighter you travel, the less carbon emissions are created. Virgin Atlantic claims that if every passenger reduced the weight of their bag by 1 kilo, they could save around 4,000 tons of carbon emissions annually. Limit your airport shopping. These days, some airports look very similar to shopping malls. One easy way to reduce the weight a passenger carries on board is to avoid any retail and duty-free shopping at the departure airport. There's no point packing lightly and then buying heavy items such as alcohol, perfume, and books at the airport. If every adult passenger bought 1 bottle of alcohol at duty-free, it would add another 1.5 kilos of weight per passenger, with the same amount of weight needlessly traveling on the flight going in the opposite direction. And when it comes to onboard meals, there's a shift underway to enable passengers to pre-order their meals before a flight or to opt out of the meals entirely. And this would allow airlines to only load the required meals, avoiding unnecessary weight, and also help to reduce in-flight waste. Around 34% of the waste generated on a flight comes from untouched food and drink. So far, no airline has decided to go 100% plant-based for sustainability, but that would be a positive step. Look at this lovely airline advert, reassuring us that we can visit this beautiful place and do so responsibly. Nobody more than me wishes that this was true, but it isn't. At the moment, fly responsibly falls into the same category as smoke healthily. There are brilliant engineers and scientists hard at work trying to come up with the solutions, but they need time, and time is running out. If we could all slow down our high carbon lifestyles, we could give them the time to figure out how to get us flying in a more responsible way. This is greenwashing. And this advert and many others have been banned for creating misleading impressions. You are now experts on aviation sustainability. And what is slightly worrying is that you now probably understand more than many aviation professionals about the subject. So next time you fly, keep an eye open for some of the ways that the industry is trying to fool you into believing you can fly responsibly and that they have everything under control. If you want to play greenwashing bingo, it's on our website. So what happened to my dream job of joining an airline sustainability team? Well, it lives on. I'm still looking for that first airline that's going to lead the way and actually lobby for positive climate regulation and start truly prioritizing sustainability. And until then, I'm choosing to work with an incredible team of volunteers at Bumprints, helping to raise passenger awareness about the extent of the problem in aviation and to show you how to use your consumer power to push for reform. Because flying is magical, but unfortunately, there's a darker side to the industry that seems to be following the tactics of big tobacco and big oil. Have we entered the era of big aviation? And this is the last slide, and bear with me. It looks complicated, but I'll talk you through it. It's based on research that looked at lobbying against climate policies by European airlines and the aircraft manufacturers and the airline trade associations. So the circle size for each airline represents their greenhouse gas emissions, and the other groups, the trade associations and the manufacturers, have standardized circles. The higher up the circles, the more actively engaged in lobbying they are, and the further to the left they are, the more opposed they are to Paris Agreement climate policy. And the metric along the bottom is basically like a school report card, and the companies are ranked from A plus to F, with the majority of aviation companies scoring E's. And even if individually these airlines are not lobbying too ferociously against climate policy, all the airlines here, except one, which is Wizz Air, are a member of one or both of the trade associations who are the most active lobbyists against climate policies. And the US airlines are not included in this study, but I think it's safe to say they are definitely not scoring any higher. And the report concludes that as a group, the airline industry is considerably more misaligned than any other sector, even fossil fuel companies. So for all their talk about fly net zero by 2050, behind the scenes, they are lobbying for policies that undermine global climate goals. So to the people of Minneapolis, we see you, we are moved by your bravery and your love for your community and your determination to stand up to evil. As you well know, grief has stages, and environmental grief does too. And these stages include denial, worry, guilt, anger, and eventually action. And action is not only a stage of the grieving process, but it is the only thing that will actually have results. And so while this talk is about personal climate action, and some actions we're suggesting are big and some are very small, every action matters. And when all our actions join together, they become powerful, as you know, and can send a very strong signal. So it's up to you to decide which actions make sense for you right now. Our only request is that you take at least one of them away with you today. And I'm very happy if anyone's got any questions or comments.